Hey everybody, Nick Espinosa, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. And we're going to do a deep dive on privacy laws because even privacy focused governments seem to be weakening their laws. Now, not all of them, but one major one here that we're about to talk about, and it is kind of depressing. Now, Suzanne Smalley of The Record had a really good write up, and for this, we unfortunately have to talk about Switzerland because the Swiss government could soon require service providers with more than 5,000 users to collect government issued identification, retain subscriber data for 6 months, and in several cases, disable encryption. That is absolutely going to devastate the Swiss tech industry, for the record. So I'm going to talk about what countries still have the best privacy laws out there, but let's start with Switzerland because this is a huge step backwards for a country that has prided itself historically on being one of the most private out there. So this proposal, which for the record is not subject to parliamentary approval, has obviously alarmed privacy advocates and freedom advocates around the world because of how it's going to destroy anonymity online, not just for the people in Switzerland, but for you and I if we're using platforms out of Switzerland, and a lot of us do. So a large number of virtual private network or VPN companies and other privacy preserving firms are headquartered in that country because they historically, as I mentioned, have very liberal digital privacy laws alongside of that discrete banking ecosystem. Even the Nazis were using it back in the day, and good or bad, that's how private they've historically been. So Proton, which offers things like Proton Mail, Proton VPN, etc., they essentially pride themselves on end-to-end encryption, ultra-private VPN and cloud storage. They announced on July 23rd that they are moving most of their physical infrastructure outside of Switzerland due to this proposed law. That is a massive shift for that company who basically has prided themselves on being Swiss-based due to the stringent privacy laws. So Proton is now investing more than 100 million euros into the EU, according to their announcement, with plans to help develop a quote-unquote sovereign Euro stack for the future, basically, of our home continent. Switzerland, for the record, is not a member of the European Union. They've notoriously and longitudinally been basically isolated and neutral from every kind of alliance, government, you name it. They even sat out World War II, which was honored by both the Allies and the Axis powers across Europe. So Proton said the decision was prompted by the Swiss government's attempt to, quote-unquote, introduce mass surveillance. And Proton's founder and CEO, Andy Yen, said, quote, "The only country in Europe with a roughly equivalent law is Russia," end quote. And that is not a country you want to be associated with when it comes to your privacy laws, or for that matter, pretty much anything else. So one of the Swiss officials spearheading this effort told a Swiss news outlet that the strict safeguards will be used to protect against mass surveillance. This official, Jean-Louis Bieberstein, described the effort as necessary to fight cyber attacks, organized crime, and terrorism. It's unclear when the proposed regulation will be implemented. The Swiss government must give the public the right to comment during a quote-unquote consultation process before imposing the rule. Now, to that point, when you have ultra-private email like a Proton Mail and other providers, they're not the only ones obviously in Switzerland, yeah, good guys, bad guys, everybody uses them, but that's kind of the point in the sense that everybody deserves privacy. We don't typically make laws to the lowest common denominator because we all know that less than 1% of, pretty much the entire world population is really trying to promote terrorism, organized crime, those kinds of things. That is the balance that law enforcement has historically played, even before the internet, right? The bad guys could use a safe and the cops would have to crack the safe, or they'd actually have to get clues, etc., etc. That's gone online in recent times. So I now want to talk about those countries that basically we have left where basically stringent laws are still the name of the game, especially for privacy. But first, I think it's important to understand what strong privacy and data protection laws actually look like and what they should include. First, they have to have a broad scope, right? It has to apply to many different types of entities, many different types of data, cross-border transfers, all that kind of stuff. It has to have really good individual rights as well. So basically, your ability to object, to erase, transparency in laws, limitation of automated decision-making, not to mention encryption standards, all that kind of stuff. It has to have strict requirements for consent, especially for sensitive data if a government wants to get access to it. They also have to have strong enforcement powers, meaning fines, basically supervisory authorities with teeth, corrective orders when we are basically being violated. And quite frankly, even the most stringent countries I'm about to talk about need more teeth. I don't think they're there. Any of these countries I'm about to list, but these are definitely the best in the world. On top of it, requires around data transfers as well. There should be localization. There should be safeguards if the data is going to be moving from one country or the other. There has to be oversight and external reviews to ensure that your privacy, basically is intact as well. And so that's some of the core things that I'm looking for if I'm looking for the laws. And so if you're looking to move your data out of Switzerland to what eventually could be a more secure country, because if the Swiss go through this, forget their tech sector altogether, not to mention banking as well. The first one on the list, hands down, actually, is where Proton is going to, and that is the European Union. Now, obviously, that's not one country, that's 27 countries in basically an economic area, all sharing laws and standardizing things, but their GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, something I know incredibly well, is often seen as a gold standard globally, and it gives you, the individual, or the EU citizen in this case, many rights. Access, correction, deletion, portability, all this kind of stuff. They have strong consent requirements. They have high fines. They can fine up to 4% of basically global turnover or 20 million euros, whichever is higher. They have fined Facebook and Google billions and billions of dollars. The problem is the fines aren't high enough, in my opinion. It shouldn't be 4%. It should be 50%, but not to mention they've got tight rules on cross-border data flows. I've consulted with many companies outside the EU that are trying to adhere to the EU, and quite frankly, it's some of the most stringent ones on the planet. And even countries outside of the EU have been modeling essentially what the EU has been doing. Even here in the United States, you can look at California with their CCPA, Illinois with BAPA, New York with SHIELD, obviously California being the biggest example, but the United States itself as a federal government needs a GDPR that we're never going to get because we have a whole lot of money in politics, and the lobbyists, the literal army of them from big tech, ensures we don't. The next country outside of the EU itself, all those countries, is actually Japan. Now, what's interesting about the EU's GDPR is that they have basically adequacy equivalents across multiple countries. And Japan has a quote-unquote adequacy decision from the EU. That basically means that the EU considers Japan's data protection essentially equivalent to the GDPR in Europe. So if you're storing stuff in Japan, language barriers aside, that's a good one. Next up is South Korea. They have PIPA, the Personal Information Protection Act, which is also incredibly strong as well. It has strong individual rights, your ability to basically lock down your access, corrections, deletions. They have strict consent requirements as well. They have stiff penalties for those companies or organizations or tech that violate your laws. And they also have really solid oversight through the Personal Information Protection Commission. They also regulate cross-border transfers and enforce corrective orders as well, meaning they're telling the Facebooks of the world to correct something, there's oversight there, or they could be kicked out of the country. So they're really strong. The next one up on the list is basically heading up to the Great White North of Canada, arguably the friendliest country on the planet. Under their adequacy laws for basically the EU, they have PIPEDA, which is actually considered very strong as well. And they've got other laws provincially, but PIPEDA is the federal national law in Canada. They've got individual rights, transparency, consent. All of this is built in to Canada as well. So if you're in the United States and you don't have some kind of government regulation that requires your data to be in the United States, parking it in Canada is actually a pretty good choice. Moving on, let's head to the other side of the planet and go down under to New Zealand. That's right, the Kiwis have really good laws as well. They have an adequacy decision from the EU, meaning that their laws are judged to be, again, comparable to GDPR. Australia, depending on the state that you're in, also has some pretty stringent laws, but federally, Australia is not where New Zealand is. So again, you're heading down under that way, head on over to New Zealand for your data privacy. And finally, let's head to South America and talk about Brazil. They have a relatively new law called the LGPD, which has many GDPR-style features. Not quite an adequacy decision for them, but pretty close. Argentina and Uruguay are pretty good as well, and some other countries for honorable mentions, but those are the ones that if you're moving your data outside of Switzerland, you might want to check. And quite frankly, the EU is literally just right over the border, the entire border of Switzerland, so that's probably going to be the first stop for a lot of companies. But there you go. That's all the privacy that's fit to print, and hopefully your data is being parked in one of those countries and nowhere else. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP, and please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, please, please attempt to stay private, informed, and secure. Take care.